Well, welcome everyone to the Shore Family Forum, the home for the Centers for American Indian Alaska Native Health and the Colorado School of Public Health, which we're a part of on the CAIANH shoots. It's delightful to see so many of you join us. As we encountered, we'll probably have more coming in because of the controlled security access to the building. And you're welcome to tour throughout as you're inclined to enjoy the art that's throughout all three floors here. It's my distinct privilege today to introduce Chris Latre. Chris Latre is an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians of Montana. And a very accomplished artist of whom we are quite proud. He published his first book, and I think it was 2018, wasn't it? A series of essays. And the most recent one on display outside in the rotunda on becoming Little Shell really traces his personal journey in terms of understanding and beginning to wrestle with the meaning of identity. Now, this is an issue that many of us, I've heard several of our fellow tribal members talk about just in the few minutes that we've been gathering together, that Chris's recounting of his journey echoes in terms of my own past. And there are many, many parallels. And before we came into the Shore Family Forum, Chris and I were having a discussion about the importance of this search and this journey for many of our young people, which has now become so much more possible because of people like Chris sharing the nature of that journey. And we hope that as a consequence of Chris's reading and the conversation to follow, I know that there are many, many people here today who are not bashful. And in fact, Mr. Roberts, a fellow Little Shell man, was already engaged with Chris Latre in ways in which I warned his daughter, Adrian, who's the CEO for our Denver Indian Health and Family Services, that I would have to separate them at dinner tonight because we discovered that there were historic rivalries between their respective high schools in Montana. So, Chris, the floor is yours. Thank you for taking time to join us. Thank you.
I got click going on.
Okay.
I'm plugged in. Can you hear me? All right.
Turned it off.
Bonjour. Bunapare Miji, Indinoe Maganadug. Chris Latre, Indigenous Cause, Chris Kashanikashin. What that is kind of a version of a traditional Ojibwe greeting. And I did so in the two languages of the Little Shell people. So as Little Shell, we are Anishinaabe. We speak Anishinaabe-Moan or Anishinaabe or Ojibwe-Moan or Ojibwe or Chippewa, all different words for the same thing, which defines who we are as a people and a culture and what our language is. And I also spoke in Michif, which is the language of the Métis people. The Little Shell are largely comprised of Métis people. And the Métis people are a cultural indigenous group recognized in Canada as one of the three indigenous peoples who predate the existence of Canada as a country. So it's the Métis, the First Nations, and the Inuit. We're all there before Canada became Canada. The Métis were also in the United States before the United States became the United States. But the United States has chosen not to recognize us as a cultural indigenous group at all. And as I like to always point out, we didn't cross the border crossed us. It's like my Little Shell tribal ID says I'm Chippewa Cree, which is kind of an Easter egg. Spiro and I were talking about Easter eggs. When you begin to try and reconnect or study a culture or a people who have been under the direct effort to erase from history for a couple hundred years, often that information only arrives in the form of Easter eggs. And maybe I'll talk about that a little bit more. But my point being is when you see Chippewa Cree in the United States, you're almost always actually seeing a Métis person. It's like our relatives on Rocky Boy, the Chippewa Cree tribe. There are Cree people, there are Chippewa people, but those Chippewa people are the same as we are as Little Shell, which are the same as the people who are in the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota, as well as the Manitoba Métis Federation in Manitoba. We are all part of the same community that existed at one time together and has since become a diaspora of sorts. So I just like to point that out. And the way I usually do these things is I will read kind of a condensed version of the introduction to Becoming Little Shell to start, because I think it kind of lays the groundwork for what the book is about, who I am, what this story is. And then because I never plan these things, while I'm reading that, I may think of something else I want to talk about. But what I really want to get to as quickly as possible is questions. I'm hoping that everybody here came because you had a question in mind or a curiosity that I would hate for you to leave the room with that unanswered. So when these things really thrive, when Native people really thrive, is when we get together and talk, as we have done for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of generations, to figure out how to live together in harmony and in opposition for countless generations. So that's my pseudo plan. I'm just very grateful to be here. I get invited to things and I never know what to expect. And I've just really been kind of bowled over by this facility, by what the work that's being done here, how it came to be. I'm kind of reminded in a way that's totally different to last spring. See, I'm already off the rails from what I thought I was going to do. Last spring, I was invited to do the commencement address at Dodson School. So Dodson is this tiny little town right off the eastern edge of the Fort Belknap Reservation on the High Line. Like even someone who is as poor a thrower as I am could throw a rock from Dodson and it would probably land in Canada. It's that close to the medicine line. And what I didn't realize until just a couple days before I was headed up there is Dodson School is so small that they graduate kindergarten, 8th grade, and high school all in one glorious ceremony. So I got to go up there and speak and move these young people into the next phase of their education. And the ceremony at the school was very typical of a commencement ceremony, very Western, very structured. And I was very curious because the administrator, she was certainly friendly enough, but clearly not of that community, introduced me as being an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Native Americans. And I've never been introduced like that before. We call ourselves Indians. And there's, I guess, people who are afraid to say the word Indian because they think it's going to be offensive. And it's not, certainly not to me. So there was that ceremony, but then the real ceremony happened afterwards, where I was invited, hey, we're going to have a dinner at the community center next door as soon as this thing is over. And that's where the Native ceremony happened. That's where, there were a couple honor songs and, there was the auntie in charge of the entire room who was just directing traffic, making sure the teenagers were carrying plates of food to all the elders. And it wasn't this kind of performative idea of like, when you go to a powwow and Native people are just kind of showing everybody else, this is how we are. This is literally how we are. This is how we do our things. And the auntie is a member of the Little Shell Tribal Council. And her mom, who's also there, is also a member of the Little Shell Tribal Council. And just that interaction, this is what this reminds me of. Going to a university, going to a big campus, not really knowing what to expect, and then finding Indianness gathered in this room. And I don't get to experience that very much. So I'm very grateful to be here. Spiro, I'm very grateful for you making this whole thing happen. So as I said, I'm going to start with a condensed reading of the introduction to Becoming Little Shell. It's a midsummer morning in 2022 in western Montana, and dark clouds boil and roil and threaten thunderstorms. After days of swelter, the precipitation is welcome, but the threat of wildfire by lightning is real. I'm driving my gray 1999 Nissan Frontier pickup. I merge onto Interstate 90 westbound where it intersects with Montana Highway 93 at the western edge of Missoula. These two routes I-90 east-west, 93 north-south are swarmed with tourist traffic every summer. These yearly visitors are here because this place is beautiful. The valley formed by the confluence of the Blackfoot, Bitterroot, and Clark Fork rivers is bordered by rolling mountains. Below the conifer-covered tree line, despite summer settling in with a vengeance, their slopes still show a hint of spring's green where they aren't patched in yellow arrowleaf balsam root. Indigenous words are on my mind today. There are countless shiny cars, hulking SUVs, and gigantic pickups pulling trailers loaded with canoes and kayaks and bicycles. I note names like Tacoma and Denali on their bumpers. Same with RVs called Yukon and Winnebago. There are others too, Indian names all, in a place not that many Indians remain. I've thought about Indians my entire life. I grew up with the vague knowledge my father's side of the family was Indian, Chippewa specifically, as my grandmother would speak of it at times. I have a dim memory of being 4 years old and sitting on the faded linoleum kitchen floor of our little farmhouse in Huson, assaulting a coloring book with crayons. When asked why I depict a pair of children with red skin, I say it's because they're Indians. My visiting grandmother, Ruby Catherine Doney Latre, sitting at the table, asks, "Is my skin red?" "No, but I'm an Indian, and so are you." I was very young, and now I'm not, but the memory has stuck with me. It wasn't until my grandfather died, just shy of 83 years of age, in late September 1996, that pieces started falling into place. I was 29 years old. A decade earlier, fresh out of high school, two friends and I headed west on the same Interstate 90 I'm traversing today on our way to Seattle to become rock stars. I hadn't seen my grandparents since making the move. By 1996, I was married with a 3-year-old son who would never meet his great-grandfather, living closer to Tacoma than Seattle and working a job that required a long, traffic-infested commute that was slowly killing my will to live. The dreams of rock and roll glory were over. I like to tell people my bandmates and I arrived in Seattle with bags full of spandex and leather when the city was on the cusp of dressing all their musical heroes in flannel and ripped jeans. In 1996, I made the drive to Plains, Montana for the funeral. Though I barely knew my grandfather, I was one of the pallbearers. It was a beautiful fall day in early October. I left my Washington home in the wee hours of morning, crossed Snoqualmie Pass eastbound through the jagged and magnificent Cascade Mountains at sunrise, then blew through the croplands of eastern Washington as the day expanded in my windshield. The sun was bright, the foliage was changing to vivid reds and yellows, and the air was crisp and clean the entire way. Arriving at the small Catholic church in Plains, I was amazed to find the nave crowded with Indians. I took my seat in the front row beside my dad and stared around in a state of puzzled awe. During the service, which I barely remember, it seemed to be more about Jesus than my grandfather. Dad kept poking me in the ribs and trying to make me laugh. When we exited the church and prepared to join the procession to the cemetery, Dad leaned in and asked, "So what did you think about all those Indians?" "There were a lot of them," I said, for lack of a better answer. What I didn't say was how astounded I was. Something my dad and his father had in common was the denial of any indigenous heritage. Suggesting my dad was native made him angry. I could never understand why. I was the opposite. I wanted to be Indian. I wanted that identity, and I took it for myself, even if it had to be largely locked up. To me, it was cool. Who wouldn't want to be an Indian? Who wouldn't want to be Chippewa? My grandfather's funeral was a turning point in my curiosity about my family history. Here was a collection of people I'd never known, but was clearly connected to. Who were they? Why didn't I know them? Why was I never allowed to know them? What was our family story? I went home with more questions, only now I could see much more clearly where I came from, even if nobody in my family talked about it. Whenever anyone asked my dad about other Latres in Montana, and there are many of us, he would deny any relation. I never heard him utter the words Little Shell, Rocky Boy, Turtle Mountain, or even Chippewa that I can recall, nor Métis, all words for people and places critical to my life now. My dad spent his life denying his indigenous heritage and, through his choice, mine as well, sometimes vehemently. Referring to my dad as Indian in any way, in most contexts, bordered on fighting words. If pressed, his calmest response was to refer to the entire idea of Indianness as complete bullshit. When he passed away in 2014, Dad left me with a lifetime of questions about who he was and where he came from. No, who we are, where we come from. I'm certain he had the answers to many of these questions, but he chose to take them with him to his grave. I decided I would do what I could to find them on my own. If not from him, then through people who lived a similar experience, through the story of our people. This book is an attempt to answer some of those questions, to tell the story of my own family history, certainly, and why my dad felt the way he did about his heritage. If I've learned anything at all, it's that I'm not the only one to grow up in these kinds of circumstances. I'm also not alone in trying to find my way back to who I was all along, a proud Indian. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a historian. I don't have an academic bone in my body. I'm a storyteller, and this is a story that needs telling. I feel compelled to share the story of the Métis people of Montana with the world, to tell the story of the Little Shell tribe, the longtime landless Indians of Montana. Because it's clear we're largely unknown, not just to the wider world, but even in Montana, the first state to recognize us as a legitimate tribe, despite our centuries-old association with a larger indigenous family. Like the stories of all indigenous tribes of the Americas, it's a sad story. It is also a triumphant story of the baddest buffalo people the world has ever seen. It is a story still unfolding. And that is my condensed introduction. Thank you. You know, I mentioned my grandma, Ruby, and her telling me that I'm an Indian, you know, as I'm sitting there coloring on that coloring book. And I always like to begin with like a shout out to the women of our community, the sisters and aunties and grandmas and great grandmas and all of those people who have been the preservers of who we are, those kinship networks. So, you know, my grandfather did everything he could to pass as white, to be white, to just be a white American citizen. And, you know, I've since come to understand why that was, and it's boarding school related. And he passed that down to my father. But my grandma, like if you look at like old census records and birth certificates and things like that, she always shows up in her early years as on the record as either R for red, Indian, or HB for half-breed, which was what we were referred to, and as a derogatory term as well, as a Métis Michif person. So she shows up there until she gets with my grandfather, and from that point forward, every record of her is W for white. So that is his influence, his insistence on her also adopting this, what is called a Jaganashi Yadasi, which Jaganash is the word for white people in Anishinaabe-Moan, and Jaganashi Yadasi is anything that you do to push your sense of being an Anishinaabe person aside in an effort to assimilate. So some people adopt that, but I want to oppose that. I can be everything at the same time, and I don't want to give up any bit of my Anishinaabe-ness in service to being anything other than what I am. And I think at her core, my grandmother felt the same way, because despite that paperwork, she made it very important to her that her grandkids knew where we come from and that we were Chippewa. She maintained contact with her sisters back in Roy and Lewistown, Montana. And she's just one of many of the women who did that. And if they hadn't, I would never have known where I come from. I never would have known that centuries old connection to this wider community. And that's what the women of our culture have done for us, have maintained those intertribal kinship networks. And by intertribal, I mean all of the people who occupied the Northern Plains and our interactions and our intermarriages and our conflicts and our resolutions that went on for centuries before Europeans ever arrived. That intertribalness also includes the Europeans, because when they first arrived, the Métis are an indigenous people who came into existence after contact with Europeans. And this is the late 1600s. And let me footnote here that in Canada, there's all kinds of lateral violence and scuttlebutt, and who knows what adjective you want to use for it, related to who's really Métis and who isn't. Well, nobody denies that the Red River Métis are Métis, and that's what the Little Shell people are. We are Red River Métis who came into existence late 1600s when the first canoe full of voyageurs paddle up, and arrive in the Red River Valley, and some great grandmother of mine looked at that sweaty, hairy, short, greasy little French-speaking dude who steps out of the canoe, and she says, I'm going to get some of that. And what she meant was like the wool or the linen or the metal tools and cooking pots. The interaction with the sweaty little dude was just part of that process. And that's what the Métis come into existence as a result of. Because indigenous people at the time, our multiple cultures, our intertribal relationships depended on family as being the only ones you could trade with. So if you weren't family, we weren't going to trade with you. Well, somebody shows up and has these life-changing trade goods that they're willing to trade to you in exchange for the things that you have. Women had a lot of agency and a lot of authority in our culture in these days. Major decisions were not made without the consultation of women, who were often the leaders as well. And everybody recognized how both sides of this relationship could benefit from trade. Well, how do you make families? You marry. So that great, whatever grandmother of mine marries this little French guy. And the result of the children that come from those early marriages are the first generation of the Métis people. Métis literally means mixed in French. And polylingual culture. We were translators for all sides of these interactions, which to me, it looks less like cowboys and Indians and more like, the bar scene in the first Star Wars movie, when there's all these aliens from all different parts of the universe and they're getting together and they're making deals and they're talking and there's music. That's what the Northern Plains was like. People from all over the world coming here and figuring out a way to interact and thrive. And the Métis were right in the center of that. For 100 years, everybody is benefiting. And I like to imagine that 100-year period is what our future could look like, where everybody's just acting in a way that's beneficial to each other. And it's not until the missionaries show up 100 years in and say, whoa. We can't have all this happening without the authority of Rome to control everything. And that's when things start to unravel. But those interactions, that intertribal, multicultural relationship of people from all over the world living together is where it all starts for us as Métis people. And our modern edition of our aunties and grandmothers or whatever are the direct ties back to that. Because if anybody never forgot, it's them. The importance of family, the importance of looking out for each other and staying connected through letters and visits and all of those things that was largely left out of the male side. So here's to the aunties and the grandmas. The Little Shell, we are a relatively new, by name only, branch of that larger community. So if we go back to the Pembina Chippewa were kind of the southwestern edge of the Anishinaabe territory. So people think of, well, aren't Ojibwe people like around the Great Lakes? Yes. I always wondered that too when I was a kid. I thought Chippewas were from the Great Lakes. What are we doing out here in Missoula and Frenchtown, Montana? Well, that came later as part of the diaspora, but the Pembina Chippewa were on that southwestern edge of that huge thing. We were on the edge of the Great Plains, and we became buffalo hunters. So we would travel to the front range of the Rockies and back a couple times a year hunting buffalo with different needs depending on the time of the year. So people say, you're Ojibwe, you're from the Great Lakes. Isn't wild rice the traditional food of your people? And I say, kind of. It is for the broader community of Anishinaabe people, but we were buffalo hunters, and wild rice is the traditional side dish of my people because wild rice goes really well in buffalo stews and on the side with buffalo steaks. That's actually a joke. I didn't deliver it very well, apparently. Mostly people usually laugh. But it is. It just shows the vastness of this territory. And Little Shell, for whom we are named, was a hereditary chief of the Pembina Chippewa. And there was a treaty that was drafted in 1850 that was never ratified, but has since been used as kind of the basis to determine where people were, what their traditional lands were, which is, again, is kind of a misnomer because of the interaction of tribal people and when it comes to land and territory and hunting grounds. But the Pembina were described as being our land from the Red River, which is the current border of Minnesota and North Dakota, and it flows north through Manitoba into Lake Winnipeg, which ultimately drains into Hudson's Bay. So from the Red River west, all the way across North Dakota into eastern Montana, largely like what is the Fort Peck Reservation now, and then south, kind of down into South Dakota. So this was our territory with lots of overlaps with other tribes, and was defined as such in this treaty that was never ratified because the purpose of that treaty was to get the Anishinaabe and the Dakota people to stop fighting with each other. We had a centuries-old constant battle with the Dakota. And this treaty was to make peace so that settlers could roll through with the railroad. And it was never ratified, but that is how we know what, at least in the eyes of the federal government, where we exist. And Chief Little Shell was a hereditary chief of the Pembina Chippewa at the time that the Turtle Mountain Reservation was created. So Little Shell is actually a title. It wasn't his real name. He was the third, so he's often referred to as Little Shell the Third. And if every person that I've talked to in the last 2 years who claimed to be a direct descendant of Chief Little Shell himself, he must have had about 500 kids. Because it's like when there's a big concert, like say some band in Denver's really small time, and you go to this show and you're one of like 20 people who saw them, and then they go huge, and then all of a sudden all of Denver says, yeah, I was at that first show. And you're looking around, there was like 15 people there, Anyway, Chief Little Shell was the hereditary chief of the Pembina, the Turtle Mountain Reservation. He takes charge from his father like in the early 1870s. We don't really know for sure. And in 1882, 1883, the reservation for the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, the Pembina, become the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And that reservation is like 450,000 acres. 2 years later, it gets shrunk 90% to 45,000 acres, which is what it is today. And Little Shell III devoted his life to preserving something for his people, because the writing's already on the wall, even as early as the 1850 treaty that wasn't ratified, that settlers are coming. And the way the United States handled it from day one, going back in the 1700s, is they would make treaties with tribes and say, okay, you can have this land, and we won't let any of our settlers live on that land. It's yours. Well, then before the ink's even dry, settlers are moving onto that land. And the tribes go back to the government and say, look, who are all these people? You said they couldn't live here. And no answer. So then there's some kind of a conflict, and a few settlers die, and then the full weight and power of the United States Army is leveled against the Indians, and they say, well, you broke the treaty. Well, it worked the other way around. And this is what's happening in the High Plains just 200 years later or 100 years later. So Little Shell, ultimately, after the reservation, it's a long story, and I write about it in the book, but he gets disenrolled along with several hundred other Turtle Mountain Chippewa members, and they become the landless Indians. And were known as the landless Indians for more than 150 years, tacked on to people who'd already ventured out, like on buffalo hunts, and realized they had nothing to come home to because settlers had moved onto it, and start creating communities in places like Montana. So that's like where my family story begins, is my Latrays and Donies were setting up communities on the Milk River, which also goes back and forth over the Medicine Line. And like when you go onto the Fort Belknap Reservation, you cross it on your way in from the west, and you cross it on your way out to the east. And they got burned off the Milk River by the U.S. Army. And so they moved to central Montana to a town which is now called Lewistown, and established that town in 1879. And my grandfather, great-great-grandfather Mose, and his wife Susie, who was actually Nakota or Assiniboine, they're the passionately engaged, loving Catholic couple who produced 15 kids, and all of those sub-generations become the vast Latrays, who I was allegedly not related to, but was very, very much related to every single one of them. And that's kind of the story, this diaspora, this expanding of people across a land that for the first 50 years of their disenrollment from where they come from, they're not a member of a tribal community legally, and they're not legal members of the United States either, because they can't become citizens until 50 years later. So it's truly a landless community of people living on the fringes of other communities with nowhere else to go because they're not welcome anywhere. And I like to pose the question, what kind of a society do you live in where it's even possible for people who have been there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years are technically not allowed to be there anymore? And I think it's a fascinating story of what happened to us overlapped in the things that we see happening around the country and around the world today. It's just a cycle that happens over and over and over again until we decide as a community that we don't want to allow that kind of thing to happen anymore. And I think the more Native people who come out and start telling these stories, whether it's about land loss or the near extinction of the buffalo and what that meant to Native people, especially the Buffalo nations of which we very much were one and are one. As we tell those stories, I think more people awake to, well, the people who lived here for 15,000 years might know a thing or two about how to live here. And now our ways of being and our relationship to the land is something that's being adopted at a vast scale around the world. And I think that is things move in long cycles, and we're in one right now. And there are a lot of people who are struggling with the cycle we're in, particularly in this country, because they never thought they would experience that. Yet there are multiple tiers of our society that's like, yeah, it's been like that for us for a long time. So that's how change happens, is when we share our stories and we recognize the things that we have in common versus the tiny little differences we have. One of my roles for the last couple of years is I was also the poet laureate of the state of Montana. And I drove all over the state, and Montana is vast. Like a few weeks ago, I drove out because I was asked to be at the South Dakota Book Festival. And I made a 2-day drive out of it because I live like an hour in from the western border of Montana. And I got up and I drove 9 hours all day and went to bed, and I was still in freaking Montana. That's a big state. And I think of how my ancestors, like I'm worried, I'm in a food desert. There's nothing but McDonald's to eat. And it's like, well, they had to plan when they left North Dakota because they weren't probably going to get food unless they could kill it on the way. So I needed to harden up a little bit. Like just because there's only McDonald's, can you believe there wasn't McDonald's back in the buffalo hunting days? So it's just, things haven't changed as much as they've changed a lot. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I'm in a university. Nobody's curious? Yes.
I'm gonna pick on you now, but I read somewhere sometime back, I can't even remember when, but I read that Thomas Littleshell refused to accept the treaty that set up Rocky Boy, not Rocky Boy, but Turtle Mountain. And I was wondering if you've ever seen anything like that.
Yeah, so the question is the story. So I've actually never heard anybody even refer to him as Thomas in a way that I've certainly never carried that. So I know who you're talking about. His real name was Ayabe, which means he who rests on the way. So Thomas Littleshell is Chief Littleshell III. And the question is that he had read that he refused the treaty that created Turtle Mountain Reservation. I don't think that's true. I know. So for me, the beginning of what ultimately creates the Littleshell diaspora is the Treaty of Old Crossing in 1863. And that was Littleshell II. So all the Chippewa tribes like of Minnesota and the Pembina are invited to this place called Old Crossing, which is a crossing of a river that was a gathering point for all the trade that went from the little town of Pembina, which like in the 1860s was the most populated trading post in that region. And Red River cart caravans would assemble there, and then they would travel to Minneapolis to trade, the Twin Cities area. And this ford of the river was often the gathering point for trade. And this is where this treaty was negotiated that ultimately created like the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation and the White Earth and all of those Chippewa tribes in Minnesota. But this is a year after the Dakota Uprising in 1862. So things were volatile. And they negotiate the treaty, and Littleshell II is one of two hereditary chiefs of the Pembina who were there representing their people. And he agrees to that treaty. And then they go back to Washington, D.C., and they make a bunch of changes. And when it comes back, Littleshell says, that's not what I agreed to. I am not going to sign a treaty with you people ever again. And so the United States recognizes, okay, Littleshell's a problem. Well, that opinion also carries into the next generation, Littleshell, his son. So Littleshell III did participate in the treaty that created the negotiation, because it's not a treaty, that creates Turtle Mountain. But what comes after is what's often known as the 10-cent treaty, which was an agreement, the Macomber Agreement. He did not sign that one and was not allowed to sign that one. And that agreement is also what delists him and his followers and anybody that they didn't like from the roles at Turtle Mountain and creates the diaspora of landless Indians. So I think that's probably the one that it's hard parsing out all of these different stories. For a long time, I always thought just keeping the different Littleshells straight. There's 100 years of someone named Littleshell who's in charge, or sometimes you'll see him referred to as Little Clam. And for a long time, it was very difficult for me to keep that straight. But talking to historians from Belcourt and Red Lake, I'm pretty sure that's the one you're talking about, is the Macomber one, which was negotiated in 1892, and I think was actually then ratified, this agreement, like in 1902 or something like that. But it's still being wrestled with in the courts. It's like 4 years ago, maybe, there was a class action lawsuit that was settled related to the Macomber Agreement, the 10-cent treaty, and a bunch of people got checks. Anybody here in the room get checks? Anybody from, it could be Pembina, Manitoba Métis, Rocky Boys, Chippewa Cree, or Turtle Mountain could potentially get checks. I got a check, I'm happy to say. It's the only Indian money I've ever really gotten. It was $50. And I'm here to tell you, you can't buy a lot of land anywhere for $50. I turned it into a buffalo steak at Montana Club that was $48, so at least I got something cultural out of it. But yeah, it's still ongoing, that discussion and debate.
Why did you get more than I got?
You got to know the right people.
That's a typical question in Indian country, right?
It is.
So thank you for that. One of the things we talked about before assembling today was the importance of storytelling and opening up this conversation to the generations that are coming now, and how the experiences of our fathers for the most part, except for our grandmothers, brought silence to that. And could you talk a little bit? I know in hearing you talk, you mentioned being at the commencement and then going afterwards to the dinner. I know that you do this a lot with younger people. Can you talk about the importance of telling these stories and opening up these avenues of conversation to identity for our younger people today?
Yeah. So I think a lot of young people grow up in Native communities, whether it's on reservations or even in urban Native communities, which there are far more urban Indians than there are reservation Indians. And there seems to be like an overwhelming lack of opportunity. And so, like in my role as poet laureate, I went all over the state, and my focus was I wanted to go to all the reservations. I wanted to go to all the little towns around reservations. Those were my priorities. But then also going to other tiny communities. And it was important for me to show up for these kids, to show them that there are opportunities, like me, you can be like me. And that story begins, at least as it relates to going in and talking to students, is my friend Mark Gibbons, who he's not Native, but he was the poet laureate of Montana for 2 years. He was the guy who had it before I did. And he tells the story. He grew up in Alberton, Montana, which was even smaller. We didn't play them in football either because they were even smaller than we were. And he tells a story about being in high school and showing up one day for English class. And the teacher says, we have a guest instructor here today for poetry. And if you want to go take a class with him instead, you can, or you can have the regular class. Like every good high school student who sees an opportunity to do something different from what they expected to do, he jumps on the opportunity to take this poetry class. Well, that poet happens to be James Welch, who is one of the most important voices in Native lit ever, as a poet, as a fiction writer, as a nonfiction writer. And he's just a guy, this is before he's famous, just going around as part of the way he makes his living is teaching these classes. So a day spent with James Welch, Mark Gibbons' life changes. He decides he's going to be a poet. And he does. He goes on, he goes to school, gets a degree, becomes a teacher, goes back to school, gets an MFA in poetry, teaches more, teaches kids, both in like as a professional teacher, but also as like a visiting teacher like I've done, and becomes, he's written like 10 books of poetry, becomes one of the most important, I think, Montana State poet laureates we've ever had, all because James Welch showed him this world. And so that's what I want to do. I'm not saying I have these grand ideas that I'm going to inspire this wave of Native writers and artists and all this stuff. But even if just one person takes on something different than they would have otherwise, I think it's worth it. And because I didn't have that. When I was a kid, if I wanted to see an Indian in a movie or in a TV show, it was some white dude dressed up as an Indian. They didn't let natives even play natives. So now that's changed. And it's changed because of people like Reservation Dogs, the TV show, where kids can watch it and see people who look like them, living lives that they're familiar with, telling stories that they're familiar with that are written by other Native people. And much of the work being done on the other side of the camera is Native people. That representation is hugely important to show kids that there is an opportunity for them to do the kind of things that they want to do. Whether it's Lily Gladstone, who should have won the Oscar, and my friend Robert Hall, he's Blackfeet, but he actually enrolled Little Shell. That's who I was talking about, who taught Lily how to speak Blackfoot for her acceptance speech, lives in Browning. His family's lived there for over a century, but because of stupid blood quantum laws, he can't enroll Blackfeet, but due to that intertribal relationship, he can enroll Little Shell. He has a picture of his daughter who's, she's probably 5, probably about this tall. And she's standing in front of the TV and Lily's gotta be emotional. Lily's on the TV, giving her speech. And just that, I feel like National Geographic should have gotten a hold of that photo as one of their, best photos of the year. Because here's this little Native girl experiencing Lily at the highest level of her craft and succeeding. And what just a absolutely wonderful photo that is. So like my book would not have been published 10 years ago, but it's because people, whether it's James Welch or Louise Erdrich, I think the person, well, literally for me, the person who is literally paying the way for my book is Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. We share a publisher, we share a speaking agent, but that book has been so globally successful and she has generated so much revenue for our publisher that they are able to publish more books by Native people, and I have become a beneficiary of that. That's the importance of us telling our stories, is the doors it opens for other people. And we are in a golden age right now of indigenous, at least in the common cultures awareness, and we don't intend, regardless of who's in charge, of wanting to erase the history of America, the real history of America, that we're not going back. And I don't think the common culture wants us to go back. That's what I tell kids. Your story is every bit as important as mine, and figure out a way to tell it. Another question.
The issues that you mentioned blood, and some of the issues that result for tribal enrollment.
Mhm.
Could you talk a bit about the origins of the whole concept of blood quantum and what the result of that has been?
So blood quantum, for those of you who don't know, is this bogus idea of Indian blood, and that you have to have a certain percentage of Indian blood before you can even be considered an Indian and capable of enrollment within a tribal community. And it didn't exist. And the curious thing about it is it's literally the mirror image of what Black people face. Works totally the opposite. If you have one drop of Black blood, you're Black. In Native communities, it's absolutely reversed. You have to have a certain amount, otherwise you're not. Which speaks to the differences in, what these communities want access to that the feds want to deny them access to. But it didn't come into a thing until like 1887, which is the Dawes Act, which was the act that began the allotment period, where the United States has determined, Indians still have too much land, and we have all these settlers that should have that land. So they decided that for Indian people to really become civilized and be assimilated into American culture, which we weren't ever asking for, they had to be private property landowners. So they went and they determined that if you had a certain amount of white blood, you were more likely to be civilizable and capable of owning your own property. So they made these lists of people, and they would just sit down and guess, okay, you look about half, you look about full, you're 3/4, and you two don't have any Indian blood at all. Well, you could be relatives. You could be brothers and sisters. And just based on how you looked, the government determined that's what your blood measure was, your blood quantum. And that is the list. Those are the bases that have moved forward since. So it was all part of the land grab. So we never cared about Indian blood or any of that until the late 1800s. And then when the United States, the Indian Reorganization Act of if I don't tattoo something on my body, I forget it. I don't have that date tattooed on me, but it's like the 1930s, I think. 24? Okay. I was close. 6 years over a 10,000 year timeline. That's right on accurate. They said, okay, you need to set up your tribal governments, and we've got this boilerplate, like plug and play for you to do so. And it includes this Constitution. And in the Constitution, it determines what your blood quantum needs to be for your people to enroll. So that's just another version of guys riding up on horses with guns to eliminate people, because that blood quantum is mathematically long-range genocide. Because ultimately you reach a point where nobody, because of the way we mixed intertribally now, both as Native people and with non-Native people, after a few generations, you don't have anybody whose blood measure meets the requirement. All of a sudden, nobody else can enroll and the tribes go away. And tribes don't have to do that. And like the Cherokee don't. They use lineage. They don't use blood quantum. I wrote an article about blood quantum several years ago for a magazine in Montana, and Gerald told me, Chairman Gerald Gray of the Little Shell, that our plan was once we were federally recognized, then we would do away with blood quantum and go to lineage as well. I hope we do that. But it requires a change to the Constitution, which at the tribal government level is just as much of a pain in the ass as it is at the federal level. But it's incredibly divisive. And that's one of the conversations, 10 years ago, Native identity was so colonized that blood quantum was one of those things that you held on to with pride. And it was meaningful because that's all you'd ever knew. But now, as more and more people tell the stories of how blood quantum has divided families and communities, people are starting to realize, yeah, you know what? Actually, it does suck. And there's a better way to do this. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Yes. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for being here. My question is about how you reconcile your Métis mixed ancestry, just basically having blood of settlers and blood of people that lost their land to those settlers.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And, it's kind of like, well, why do you talk so much about your dad's side of the family? You don't talk about your mom's side of the family because she's non-native. The way I reconcile that with myself is in Anishinaabe worldview, we believe everybody is Anishinaabe. All people of the world come from the first person that's created as a result of, Kichi Manitou taking a handful of soil from each of the four directions of Mother Earth after all of the relatives who are already here are sending prayers to creation that we are missing one relative, and that one relative is us as humans. So Kichi Manitou creates that first person, puts that soil in a shell, breathes through that shell, and what emerges on the other side is the first person, and that first person is Nanabuju. And from Nanabuju comes all of the other people of the world. So we believe that all people are Anishinaabe and that we've just spread out and created differences, but we ultimately come back to the same source. So when I identify as Anishinaabe, it includes everybody. And it includes my mother and where she comes, the Czech and the Dane and the English that make up her ancestry. But by being Anishinaabe on Turtle Island in North America, it's because that is the land I'm standing on. It's the only land I've ever stood on. And that is where the Anishinaabe, where Kichi Manitou, where that soil came from, that when he created Nanabuju. So the land is our first teacher. And like the first task that Kichi Manitou gives Nanabuju is to go out in the world, and like the first original instruction, and teachers love it when I tell this story to kids because it's to pay attention, to keep your mouth shut and listen, because that's what Nanabuju does, is go out in the rest of the world, tells them who everybody else is and what that relationship with each other can be. And for a long time, that's how we live. So that's how I reconcile it. As Native people, it wasn't preordained that there would be colonialism. There's that 100-year period just in our tiny little area where everybody kind of got along. There's enough for everybody. This world is vast and abundant, and we can all have it together if we share. Yet very early on, we began this practice of letting this tiny, narrow band of our population just hoover up all of those resources for themselves. And we are left with the scraps. Literally, in the case of Little Shell people, living on the outskirts of city dumps and slaughterhouses, living off the scraps of wealthier people. We don't have to live like that. And I think as encompassing all that in my identity as an Anishinaabe person is a way for me to practice the act of getting along with everybody. I mean, my relative here went to Loyola High School, which was our arch rivals when I went in high school, but I still love you, man. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, yes, way over there.
One of the greatest books I've read the last 10 years was David Troyer's Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. I've never been able to ask anybody else really what they thought of it. And I would love your take on it and how you might use that as a teaching tool, maybe with our students here on campus.
David Troyer. He's Ojibwe from Leech Lake, and we did an event together. And I forgot to bring socks. And I didn't want to wear my shoes without socks because it's summertime and that's kind of gross, right? We're standing together and we're hugging it out. And he's kind of a well-dressed individual. And he steps back and he looks at me and he says, "So, flip-flops at your own reading, eh?" Like he's totally judging me for my footwear. So I've had a grudge against David ever since he dragged me, in front of all these other people. David is great. That book is, I think, as you mentioned, one of the most important books of the last 10 years. It was a shortlist finalist for the National Book Award. I think it should have won the year it won. And his brother, Anton, who is a huge language and culture elder, even though he's, younger than me. Together, they are doing great work for our people. And that absolutely is an incredible book. Anton wrote a book called Everything You Needed to Know, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians, but Were Afraid to Ask. So there's an adult version of it, and then they published a YA version of it as well. And my friend, a colleague and I who do a lot of work together, created an online course that began as Native American Studies for teachers. Because in Montana, we have a mandate, a state constitutional mandate that teachers teach Indian Ed in all subjects, K through university. And there are a lot of teachers who hit jobs in Montana and they've never learned. How do they know what to teach when they were never taught in the first place? So the purpose of this class was to educate teachers, at least at the base level, of what they should know going in to teach children and young adults. And then that class morphed into a Native American Studies for everyone that people can take, which she used as the basis, that Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask book. So if you have specific questions about it, sure, but it's a worthy, David's point was, everybody thinks Indians went away with Wounded Knee in 1890. But we continue to thrive. I don't use the word resilience. We just regathered and what was the word we were using this morning? Survivance. Yeah. And now people are looking to us to help lead them out of the quagmire that they've tripped into. And I think that book is an important one. Some of the facts aren't quite right. What he writes about the little shell, he probably should have talked to somebody different, but I'm willing to, let that slide. I think it's a good book. Mm-hmm. We use that. Oh, yes. Question over here. I'm going to, while you're carrying the mic, I'm going to tell the story of that class, the Native American Studies for Everyone. Dr. Anna East, she was a teacher on the Flathead Reservation for 20 some years. She's originally from Virginia, but now she does native language courses online for tribal communities. But she and I and another colleague who works at the Missoula Public Library got together and created this festival called Indigipalooza. And we had it for the first time last summer, August 1st and 2nd. Joy Harjo was our headliner, and we invited all these native writers, and we had panels, and there were hundreds of people who came out. It was a huge success. And to fund it, we crowdsourced it. So Anna developed this class, and I have a newsletter called An Irritable Métis, and I've got a pretty big following. And I put that out there saying, look, we need to raise money for this festival. And one of the ways we're going to do it is Chickadee Community Services is her nonprofit that's devoted to Native education. She's going to offer this Native American Studies class that you can attend and donate on a sliding scale, whatever you can afford. And whatever money she raises from that, we're going to donate directly back to Indigipalooza. And, more than 500 people signed up. And we generated the bulk of our $100,000 budget was generated through that class. And we're going to do it again this year because we're doing Indigipalooza again this year. And we haven't announced it officially yet, but Robin Wall Kimmerer has agreed to be our headliner this year. And we've got Rebecca Nagel, who wrote a great book called By the Fires We Carry. She's Cherokee, and it talks about the Indian Removal Act and how, even then, popular opinion was against Indian removal, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do this, but Andrew Jackson did it anyway. Some people say, oh, this terrible thing that Trump's doing, it's unprecedented. It's been precedented multiple times, presidents acting against the law. So Rebecca's coming. Yeah, it's going to be great. The Dead Pioneers are coming. We aren't telling the funders that yet because they're a very anti-authority punk rock band from Denver. If you haven't heard of them, they're great. Anyway, final question. See, I don't have anywhere else to go today until dinner. So we could lock the doors and stay in here all day if you want to.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for speaking and sharing your wisdom and time with us today. Very much appreciated. My thoughts, I'm still formulating the question, but maybe you can help me, are really about identity and cultural appropriation, not just within your own history. Obviously, you've had a tremendous journey of gathering a lot of data and processing and integration and healing for yourself that you're able to share with us, which is tremendous. And the message that you're giving that was so important about making the decision to stop the war, right? Whether it's internally with ourselves or externally with the world, between tribes, between governments, between nations, between people, right? And there's so much wisdom that you're sharing in about finding that integration and finding that place of acceptance for all that you are, all that is, and being able to live with that in the world. And I see people who believe that they're outside of that, right? And they're looking for the very things that you're talking about and are on a journey of their own of finding that connection and that oneness and that integration. Could you speak to maybe, like, my experience comes from South American shamans and medicine ceremonies and sort of I would call my personal concern with the cultural appropriation of indigenous medicines, plant medicines, land medicines, ceremonies that are being shared in sort of like as a bridge. I think of the Dave Cushane movement and the sort of Turtle Lodge and, bringing more native ceremonies outside of the culture to help people find their way, find their humanity again. Right? So I'm just curious if maybe you could speak to that process of individuation that brings you back to the whole and the cultural appropriation that we can see in all sorts of ways happening in our world today. Thank you.
Yeah. That's a huge question. Lock the doors. No, and so first, and Spiro and I were talking about this. I have no problem with people exploring culture and practices. It's when they monetize that. So, and like ayahuasca is I think what you're kind of referring to. And I know people have done that. And they go back and they come back to Bend, Oregon or Boulder, Colorado, and they open these, places where you can pay to have this experience. It's not about paying to have an experience. That to me is when you cross the line of appropriation. Now, as individuals, if we go like if somebody comes to an Anishinaabe community and they want to learn the 7 grandfather teachings and they want to live according to that, I'm all for that. Because that is something that grew out of this land. But as soon as they say, okay, now I'm going to have an online class and you can pay $200 and I will teach you the 7 grandfather teachings. Our teachers don't get paid, and there is exchange. I offer tobacco to an elder if I want some piece of information, or if they give something, I will give. When I travel around Montana and I know I'm going to be in native communities, I have a tote bag full of little bags of tobacco that I can offer in return for teachings and stories and knowledge that people give me. That is my obligation. And appropriation happens is when you don't fulfill your part of the obligation. So there's a lot of stuff that gets tagged as cultural appropriation that I don't really care about, because we all appropriate, even, all of these other native communities that have adopted glass beads. That started in our territory and grew. And you could say, they appropriated the Michif way of flower design with beads. I don't care. It just makes the world more beautiful. But so appropriation is a bad word for what we've been doing all along as people from when we first sat down at a fire and someone from another community stumbles in, they say, well, we do this way, and then we adopt it ourselves. So that's just part of the natural world. It's like a butterfly mimicking the wing pattern of something so the others think that it's a predator. It's just part of the natural world sharing our knowledge. But again, I'm kind of talking in circles here. For me, the issue is when you try and monetize it and it becomes a commodity rather than a way of living. Thank you.